I'm not Christina Hamilton, but thank you, Andrew Rogers on the organ. If any of you are Lou Reed or Velvet Underground fans, you might have recognized some of that. Thanks, Andrew, for pitching in with that at the last minute. Today's event is a U of M bicentennial event, and I want to thank, before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank our series partners for their support, the Institute for the Humanities and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM and Chelsea River Gallery. Thank you, sponsors. And just for all of you who show up every week, this is the last event of the fall season, so if you come next week, there won't be anybody here, or they're seeing a movie or something else, and you don't get credit for it. But the season recommences January 11th, and the new roster will be out very soon in the next week or so, so watch for that. Okay, so it's the end of the semester for those of you who are in school. Who has lots of work? Who's a Red Bull fan? 5 Hour Energy? Monster? Other stimulant? Take a nap? Crack. Good. Just say no. Those things can give you a boost. They sort of get into your system. I had a friend who had never taken Red Bull before, and I think he was up for 3 days. It didn't make his work any better. It gets your heart racing. But the truth is, we could just individually and collectively say, this is really no way to live, and that busyness and our designs for modulating our finite bodies are less imaginative and maybe more obfuscation. Yet the source of the problem persists. If you take that Red Bull, or last night I couldn't sleep, so I took 2 Tylenol PM, and they knocked me right out. But if the source of the problem persists, we remain resigned to a stopgap solution. Think of that down the line, whether individual lives, community issues, or collective concerns. Our often response might be, towards the end, the bigger the problem, the bigger the pill. Throwing something into a broken system to get it to register both change and signal the presence of a problem is part of Buster Simpson's MO. In the 1980s, Buster took big hunks of limestone and chucked them into troubled rivers. With antacids in the stone, it was a process like sort of sending a giant Rolaids into the river, where the soft limestone discs neutralize the acid pH, working both metaphorically and pharmaceutically. Incidentally, after these giant Rolaids went in, the process of adding limestone to acidic rivers is now a standard practice with environmental agencies. Throughout his career, Buster Simpson has made artistic decisions that are designed to reveal, rather than cover over, histories or places and systems that exist under their surfaces, under all our surfaces. And for more than 4 decades, Buster Simpson, artist in public rather than public artist, has been a persistent, inventive, and often humorous ecological and social conscience for neighborhoods and cities in constant states of transition and renewal. Buster Simpson's vision of the world and the cities that we live in presents groundbreaking contributions to dialogues about the health of communities and the societal obligations of the artists striving to affect real change in public life. So before you take another Red Bull, before we seek out stopgaps, whether it's Red Bull or Rolaids or, as I know, Tylenol PM, look to Buster's actions, from his agitprop work starting early on in his career and continuing till today to ecological master plans, where the possibility of intervening on a personal scale in larger issues of industrial eco-pollution are possible. One of my favorite expressions that is generated from Buster's work is these personal interventions can be quite powerful. I've read him quoted as saying, "The revolution is incremental." So let's start it now. Let's welcome back one of our own Stamps alums to the stage, Buster Simpson.
Thank you, Nick. How do you do? Little repurposed meditation on Duchamp repurpose, putting the shovel back to work that he took out of its original context and put it in the museum. But while it was on the loading dock, you might have heard the story that it got used by somebody out on the loading dock that needed to shovel the snow. We're negotiating with the university right now to allow students to get credit for shoveling the diag instead of phys ed class in the future. So progress is not linear in this talk. Tonight, it is Remembrance Day for Pearl Harbor. It seems like Pearl Harbor is every day these days in one way or another. Nick alludes to that. This piece is called Millipede. It's Army helmets that saw action in World War II. It's now in a kind of a protective posture, much like when you see the potato bug curling up. The kind of the residue of that history is leaching, seeping in a plume toward the Columbia River from the Hanford Nuclear Reserve in eastern Washington. Let's see, so that one song, I was born in Saginaw, Michigan, that you might have picked up on. That's true. And then I moved to the watershed. I'm from that watershed, and one of the tributaries is the Cass River. Every spring there was a flood, because we lived in a floodplain, like a lot of people do. That back when flood insurance was a lot cheaper than what it's becoming now. And you know, but of course it replenished the farmland, so there's value to it. And for me, it was kind of an early learning experience of redistribution of wealth, because as the flood receded, the bounty that got dislodged from wherever it was lying and floated into someone else's domain, to me seemed to be free for the taking. The Bentley Museum in town might have historical information on the Once Group, and my tenure here at art school was, and a number of us found that the Once Group was a kind of a key moment in our growth. A collaborative group of a number of different disciplines, peripherally in the art world and directly in the art world. Some of them are professors, some lay people from the community that were doing very imaginative environment pieces and performances and happenings. And then my first gig out of art school after getting an MFA was at Woodstock. Little did I know at that time, but there was promise of being paid, having a budget, and being put up. So fresh out of school, that seemed like a good deal, particularly for an artist. And so we did a number of pieces, but probably the biggest learning experience and the most important, probably or one of the most important for my career, was that most all of the work that the 8 of us artists labored on for 2 months, beginning at one location and then moving everything to another location, was during the festival reappropriated to the necessities of life, constant rains, and just a miserable time for a lot of people, other than listening to the great music. So a lot of the work just got used for firewood and building shelters and bedding. So for, you know, an impressionable artist coming out of art school, this was a good wake-up call about its relationship with society. Another learning curve was this piece, Parable, nested inside these light rail track, minted in 1908. There's a date on them, about the time that Henry Ford started his assembly line. Are these well, they're either pears or they're wrecking balls that are cast iron, 1 inch thick, made out of cast iron engine blocks. And it's part of a light rail public art project, which I do a fair amount of work in that direction. So it sat there for a little while, and then this happened. Exactly. Now, the unfortunate thing is nobody contacted me to see if I wanted that to remain that way or to remove it. I would have obviously preferred it to remain. I think it made it far more interesting. So, Poetic Utility settled in Seattle, and it was at the very beginning of a Percent for Art program, and also starting to integrate artists into design team collaboration with other members. So there's the once group kind of coming back in a new form, and it's somewhat being you, the patron, the taxpayer. I have a responsibility to many of you who have as equal a high standard for utility as you do for art. Those two things had to be part of the mix of whatever comes out of this thing. So there's a number of artist in residence programs that have happened over the years in Seattle, and the different utilities where an artist actually has an office. I didn't, but some do, an office right in the department, and would advise them on opportunities that may not occur to them. Parallel with that was my self-initiated work that went on in what I called my laboratory. And it was important that it was my neighborhood, that I walked every day and I could monitor whatever I put out there. It was a good way for me to learn what the threshold was for acceptance, risk managers issues, all of that kind of like stuff that tends to dumb down public works. Because, you know, primarily if you're an artist that works in a museum or in the street, the bottom line is it's got to be poetic. It's got to have a ring to it. It's got to be good, you know, whatever that is. We try to figure that out. But, you know, it can't just be something that gussies up and adds a pastiche to the veneer. Oops, let me talk about this. So this is a shared clothesline, first put up in 1978, shared clothesline between a fixed income housing unit and a luxury condominium in Post Alley in the market, to be shared back and forth. If a line were bare, it could be an alien harp. And then the next slide is 35 years later, when I had a retrospective at the Frye Art Museum. This hanging of clotheslines there's ordinances against it and covenances within condominiums for having unsightly things such as your clothes out drying. So that's kind of a, you know, so what do we have to do? Go to Europe to look at beautiful clothes hanging on the clothesline? That's the issue. So putting that out. A poem to be worn, sandstone, like one of the prime building materials in the Pioneer Square, or the old part of Seattle, put out in the street as a paver to be intentionally worn. So there's something about things that add value as time puts its imprint on the material or embeds into the material. Continuing that, that paver idea was the beginning of putting our mark out on this laboratory, as I refer to it. This project is initiating the idea that the neighborhood is to be adopted by the community. So taking suitcases that were manufactured at the Skyway Luggage Company in the Belltown neighborhood, gathering from the seed bank of this 35-year-old nurturing of a green roof, an ecosystem that has been totally self-supported, not intentionally planted, but wind-blown plants that have propagated there, and those that have survived stay, and that became the seed bank for the beginning of what could be green roofs on this project called Growing Vine Street. And so the opened up suitcases along the street just became kind of the human occupation. Is we're here it is. One of my studios that I moved out of in the nick of time. Portable landscape. Community planting of, in this case, an Oregon white oak native to the Northwest. The intent is the more people that you can get involved with the planting of something, the more there will be people looking out for it. About a month later, we monitored it. We knew it was doing well, but it disappeared. And we knew it was like kind of, what do you call it, sanctioned terrorism, like officially done by the city, who we were still at a little bit of an antler dance with about who really controlled the street. And we were trying to stretch the envelope about what could be a suitable street tree. And we were calling it an urban arboretum. And that gave the city, we reasoned with them, a laboratory for them to monitor what trees really grew. So there's a number of trees that now, 30 years later, are growing up and down First Avenue, cedar trees, a number of trees that were like off limits now that are there. So this tree, we rescued it from the city dump. That's the shot of it there. And we put it back out on the street. So we got more cooperation. They knew that, you know, we were serious. This is also a street where the budget was such that we could only afford like very small caliper trees to put out. Happy hour back in that time started at 6 in the morning. And so there was a lot of like breaking of limbs, mending with crutches to support trees that we deemed would be in time an example of urban bonsai. Trees that, much like when you are at Timberline or at, you see the forces of nature against the tree and its prevailing winds and the way that it gestures to least, to give with the wind. This, in a sense, is to give to the elements of the city. So it was obvious that we needed to protect these trees somehow, and so this series of images talk about where these bed frames came from. Some of the old hotels along First Avenue, which were SROs, single resident occupancy hotels, and that we just bent them in half and nestled them around the trees. Then you see at the end there foundry patterns, and then the cast iron. Eventually, like 25, 30 years later, these start to replace the ones that got really quite battered and unusable anymore, that were very thin, cheaply made metal bed frames. Now they're solid cast iron bed frames that encircle the trees. And the crutches and whatnot kind of pull along this story that some get it, some know that the legacy of this thing going on for all this time, which is kind of important in, particularly in cities, when you see something that you've cherished be eradicated, so to speak. without any thought or intent, it appears. This tries to address that. Such as trees. This cherry tree was in the Pike Place Market. It was a volunteer that predated the restoration of the market in the 1970s. And so in a sense, it was a holdover from pre-renovation. And the developer of this building came along and wanted to remove it. Obviously, he was made to work around it. And it was there for 30 years. And then finally, you know, just this last year, it died, partially from the neglect of the owner, but old age. And the jury is out on the responsibility of the owner owning up to the legacy that was established here. And this is always that private, public kind of thin ice thing about how we work together as a community, even though there's this notion of ownership. Seattle George Monument, one of my first large pieces in Seattle, obviously taking the seal of Seattle, South, Chief South, and the profile of George Washington from the highway sign. And it's kind of like this notion that, you know, sometimes there's this kind of derogatory term, Indian Joe. Well, I took Seattle George to kind of invert that a bit, and made a 30-foot high sculpture that the profile of George Washington is a double-edged cutting blade wind vane that blows downwind and over time begins to trim invasive English ivy that grows up the profile of Chief South, 24-faceted profile of Chief South into that profile of George Washington. To me, it's like George is the template, is this cookie cutter, and Chief South is the armature that will outlast the landscaping scheme, regime of this artificially maintained landscape that this sculpture sits on and is fed by an artificial system. So it goes back and forth, and then you're in front of the board of directors of the Washington State Convention Center, and they're concerned about, well, Mr. Simpson, is this going to work? And I say it works whether it works or not, because it's our attempt to manipulate nature. pH indicator parasol. Taking lichen, the dye of lichen, which is a pH indication of what acid rain might be coming down on us from. You know, we're now in Seattle downwinders from China. We're successfully so far blocking the coal trains from getting from the West Coast to China, where will be the downwinders of more. And kind of an interesting thing, the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong a couple years ago. Very clever, very subversive, very simple, very clandestine kind of way of finding protection against the riot police. I think a line of Kevlar umbrellas will be coming out. Okay, let's see. It's not planned. Oh, where is it? Oh, there it is. Good.
The installation Hudson Head Water Purge, installed in 1991 in New York, and an earlier piece, the salting of the Nisqually River headwaters with limestone, is part of a continuing series dating back to 1983. The limestone sculpture is a populist environmental agitprop, working both metaphorically and pharmaceutically. As metaphor, it dramatizes the crisis of person and planet as one, acid indigestion and acid rain, a connection the media picked up on when they coined the title River Roll AIDS and Tums for Mother Nature. Right over there. So, by the way, that those discs were in a show at the Hirshhorn in their central fountain. It's always a dilemma for us that make installation art. What do we do with the stuff after we make it? And it's nice if you've got an afterlife or something. So this actually went in and purged the headwaters of the Hudson River. This is an installation at the Frye Art Museum of the two sides of the purge factor here, the antioxidant. One is the Hudson River purge, but also the limestone rock is also possibly a projectile. And this was a video loop that was going on constantly. So this is a shot of what you've just seen, and this is as if David, I guess, taking on citadel of the mindset of what we're doing to our planet. The photographer that photographed that last shot, Valerie Silver, is noted there. What we love will save us. This is a silt fencing, a utility. It's just a common product that is put up at the beginning of every construction site to keep the erosion of soils into the river. In this case, it's the Willamette in Portland. David Oakes is the writer. This is a potlatch, a community event, the Salish. We've renamed the Puget Sound the Salish Sea. It goes on for a good half day of tribal members gathering and celebrating, and it's a wonderful way of again redistributing wealth. The person who throws the party is the chief, generally the one of wealth, who shares that wealth back to the community in this process. The plate, the picnic plates, I was happy to see that they were using them because I had been doing a series before that of those picnic plates, paper picnic plates. And here's in process shot at the Kohler factory where I did a residency, casting these plates in the same material that the Kohler toiletware is made out of, the slip porcelain enamel. Then they were low fired and placed at various outfalls, East River in New York, and the Duwamish on the East Coast, two in particular. This is the East. This is the East River material. I mean, in some cultures, we would really rather to have an uneventful plate. We'd rather have it all white. And in this case, believe me, we'd rather have it all white, steeping in the water, bringing it out. You don't want to see a lot of this
trace metals on it. And then this is the Duwamish one. They're seductively beautiful. Serving tray. They all have a knockout in the back, much like electrical boxes, so that you can turn them into gargoyles if you want. This is the setting of a number of folks at the Frye, where we all ate off those plates. That bell that you just saw is repeated here. This is the Belltown Cafe, hangout back in the early 80s. Once a year, the bell pan that hung as a sign would be taken down on Groundhog Day, and a root pie would be cooked up in it, baked in the big oven, and served for free, and then put back up. Just a way to bring people together, but also because it's on Groundhog Day. My theory is it addresses the closer to the true meaning of Groundhog Day. Number one, it is really an ancient ritual of spring, but it's also for the more contemporary. It's when you go back into your root cellar and all that's left are the really hardy roots, rutabaga, parsnips, potatoes. So there's the pie about to come out of the oven there. And it's been re-energized after all this time, because it had a good community building qualities to it, and so it's now been activated again. Back to the First Avenue Urban Arboretum, we had saw cut with the approval of the city, and that's how we got where we got. We had the saw cuts made, and then they were opportunities in the waiting. They were kind of our permission that we could bust open that hole. It had been deemed okay by the engineers. There were no electrical infrastructure underneath there. Any damage could occur. And so this was one that actually received a composting commode, because we found that the quality of the hard pan glacial till in that area of town was not rich enough for our trees. So we invited a number of the homeless that live in that area. I mean, we just put it out there. We didn't have to invite them. They knew what this Santa can was for. And you know, sometimes you just get an off-the-shelf thing that triggers to the people who need to use something that's what it's there for. And we're not trying to make a kind of an art statement out of something fancy that costs a lot more, because I'm paying for it myself anyway. But, and it also disguises itself when the health department drives up and down the street. They don't know what's going on in there. They assume that it's a chemical John instead of something that drops down into a tree pit. Well, that lasted for about 3 weeks or so, and we struck an agreement with the city that because they knew they had a problem, that not with me, but with this problem of indiscriminate defecation going on in the neighborhood, and from a human services standpoint, just giving people common respect. So the University of Washington, at that time actually Doug Cobo, who was Dean of Architecture here, earlier, I believe. Yes, earlier. No, later. We brought students down and analyzed, and so there's this collaboration, there's this discussion about this issue, and they actually came downtown and were there for a week doing workshops about ways that you could provide some human dignity to the transient population. So, you know, that was in the early 80s, mid 80s, that was all going on. I was invited when the city was looking at a new wastewater facility, still unfortunately the flush system. And I actually, when I was interviewing, I reminded him of the composting commode, and it says, you know, when you're looking at a $1.7 billion wastewater facility, how much would it cost to give everybody that you're anticipating will be hooked up to this service a composting commode? Which would be, what would be the price point one versus the other? But I still got invited to work on the project. And, but out of that, first off, 3 artists were brought in to analyze the opportunities that then would spread the wealth. 1% of $1.7 billion is a fair amount of money to disperse to some creative thinkers that can take further what the assumptions are. So this is the facility. The purple pipe structure in the background, purple pipe being reclaimed water, which was a big part of this project, is that the water that was all going to be reclaimed and repurposed along a long line that eventually makes it down to Puget Sound. So what's not used in Puget, or what's not used along the line, eventually outfalls into Puget Sound, which is an issue. Relatively clean, but there's still some, you know, endocrine disruptors that are in this water. The sculpture really kind of addresses that function of the off-gassing of the chlorine water at the plant. So in a sense, as you come into this entry into this large facility, which also has an educational a building, so a lot of school kids are coming in there every day. You're driving by something that's still part of the plant, but it is also like a work of art. This is what the outfall, I patterned it after this outfall that's actually now in Puget Sound, and it disperses much like my piece disperses the chlorine. This disperses the water from the plant. And this is another view coming up from this, what I call the Bio Boulevard. And if you see at the end there, I guess it's it's a water molecule Mickey Mouse sucking on a bubble tea straw, which is purple pipe water, which we're all too like, you know, we would be, we'd take offense at drinking this water, but at some point we will be. And then, the issues is what's in the water. This is a lead toilet seat that's now in the collection of the Seattle Art Museum, with kind of a layer of their fetish detailing on it, areas that have markings on them. Host analog. Here I am out being ordered around by a logger in the Portland Bull Run watershed. Almost said bullshit, sorry. Bull Run watershed, looking for some old growth nursing logs. And we found a lovely specimen, 8 foot in diameter, 8 foot sections were bucked, and it was a class 2 log, which means that it was ready to start accepting, like a nursing log or a host log, new vegetation on it. And in this stage, there's more life involved here than there is in a living tree. So it was brought into Seattle into Portland from the Bull Run, the watershed for Portland, and placed in front of the Oregon Convention Center. That arc is the irrigation system, the misting irrigation system that is obviously from the Bull Run watershed. And then this kind of dynamic progression over time of what a nursing log would do in a whole new context, which is urban. So it's very much about the boogie-woogie of what an urban situation is. You've got invasives, exotics, as well as natives, all trying to find harmony with each other. And this is kind of another view of that, the progression of the nursing log and my daughter. And another view of the misting system, and another view. Now this has been there for a number of years. In fact, it's gone through one and about to go through its second changing of everything around it. But it itself remains. And so the artist comes back and negotiates what value added can be brought to the perimeter around it. And we're actually enlarging the area. It's a very subtle but well-loved piece. This is my one of my gardeners, a random gardener, the blue jay, that's brought in probably a pin oak acorn, because I noticed that there's a pin oak growing out of there now, not native. You know, there's a number of trees that have matured there that are not native. So, you know, to the purist who wants like native plants, this drives them nuts. But to, I think, somebody that really, in fact, the forestry department in Corvallis at the university come down and they study this because it's a unique phenomena that it's about the dynamic displacement. And there is legal presence for trees having standing, which means that a tree could own itself. And that's what I'm trying to work through the legal system, because I can't find a lawyer that's willing to even like start talking about having something remain and be protected for 1,000 years. But this is probably what the phenomenon that eventually comes out of the arrangement of the large trees that grow out of these nursing logs are these, this is kind of one option that you might have. And my daughter just became a lawyer a couple days ago. And social justice, I figured this is social justice, right? You know, you saw Christo's work, maybe some of you did, and he did small, beautiful drawings to realize the big, beautiful things. I do the big, beautiful things to help subsidize my other stuff that I do out in the streets. So this is, but I still get my licks in. This is Carbon Vale. It's an airport parking garage. It's 60 feet in diameter, about 60 feet high, made out of stainless steel woven wire mesh that's opened up where vehicles have to come in and out of this cylinder that cars ramp up and down, getting to different levels in the parking garage. So it's in the daytime, it's aluminum quality. It's stainless steel quality. It's very subtle, but somewhat magical. And at night, different parts of it work with the illumination. So this notion of this nanotube, this large nanotube, and the carbon veil idea was playing with that a bit. And then for the folks that are journeying up this corkscrew, that's quite a trip for them. Incidents at the International Glass Museum in Tacoma, Washington. Those are 4x8 sheets of glass, 4x8 sheets of plywood. What's the difference? And in the background, Arthur Erickson, the Canadian architect who designed the burn cone, which is typical of the Northwest at the time when we used to burn up all the leftover scrap pieces of wood from the milling operation. But now it's the burn cone for the glass shop down underneath with the Fibonacci shingling that this geometry of the two kind of work off from each other. And being incidents, it's basically just captures the light of the day and the night. So it's much subtler in this day and age of the overuse of LED lights. It's kind of refreshing just to let something kind of catch the ambient light of the area. This is a landfill in San Antonio, Texas. And there are 2 of 3 wiki-ups that were placed on top. Wiki-ups are very passive, very modest structures that First Nations and Aboriginal folks would use in the Southwest. Basically shade structures. They become hangouts for people that are hanging out in this park now. The limestone snake bench with the blankets thrown over, the blankets being made out of woven wire mesh thrown over the top, just like the Aboriginal would use a blanket to throw over some bent over saplings. Solar lit. Both of them had solar power, just kind of sistered on. Brush with illumination, a very early piece, but one that for many years was monitored conditions of the Falls Creek in Vancouver, BC. There's solar panels, a ferrule with electronic data accessing information, and a cursor for the bristle, and then basically outriggers that would go up and down in the with the tide. So this is some of the communication calligraphy drawings that this calligraphy brush was creating, and illumination. This is kind of a diagram of how the piece would respond. It's on a gimbal. It would move in any direction that the wind, tide, and currents would take it. I think, that it was kind of tongue-in-cheek when I brushed with illumination. I knew that there was going to be a learning curve here for me as well. And that was that there you see me up there 8 years ago, loading up into the ferrule, the data machine, the heavy batteries, and all the electronics that talk about the qualities of the water and the direction and the elevation and the barometers. Now the iPhone pretty much can do most of that. So I don't think I'll need the barge anymore. And another part of the learning curve is maybe I don't even need the iPhone. Maybe I need to just make it a habitat for the cormorants. And that's like, if you've been around long enough with your work, at some point, what in our culture, durable goods is 3 years. That's what they say durable goods is. Well, my Maytags are still working after about 30 years, but, and of course Maytag is out of business. But what do we do with these? How do they evolve? And when they're out in public, how do they evolve? It's much different than that lead toilet seat that became the property and the custodial protection of the university or of a museum. So that's a different mindset than when work is put out into the public. And I think that a lot of artists are starting to think more about social practice is a term that's bandied around a lot now. I think that it's been around for a long time. It just has never been called that. I think anybody that works in public needs to be conscious of those issues. This is a project that was put out to the community of Portland, Oregon, soliciting anyone who in 50 characters or less could distill a beautiful poetic moment of what it means to be riding on public transportation or the mindset that one would have riding public transportation. So these, again, are the silt fabric. The line was going to be called the Orange Line. Fortunately, they made orange silt fencing. Out of the 1,000 entries that we had, a team of writers and poets selected 100, and those 100 were first stenciled on this silt fencing, and then it was set out at the construction sites for the construction workers to pick up a roll of this silt fencing when they needed it, take it to the area and open it up. So in a sense, they were part of the curatorial process, although they didn't know what the poem said inside until they unraveled it, but its placement became part of their stewardship. So they're going up around. There was a number of locations, over 7 miles, that over the process of 3 years and all this construction going on, particularly around areas where there was bottlenecks of traffic, and you would be reading this poetry. The behind-the-scenes work that goes on with a lot of this public work is that there's a lot of communication that has to go on because you're part of a bigger team. This is the way they communicate. So there has to be documents produced that legibly everybody can review and be sure that the risk managers are happy, the city is happy, everybody's happy. There's discussions. And the nice thing about this kind of process is there is discussion. When I've occasionally worked with a private entity, if they don't like it, there's no discussion afterwards. There can't be this kind of arbitration. So, but then if they do like it, happens right away, and that's great. So there's issues with both. So eventually, you know, they start to lay the sidewalks, concrete sidewalks, and this is a testing of one of the poems. To, you know, because we do a testing, we make sure that the finishers can like stamp those words in there nicely while the concrete is fresh, and that's important. We stamped letters into fresh concrete. People then knew that this was something that was thought of and not hindsight and sandblasted in later. That sculpture. So there's a number of places along the alignment where at one time the guy driving in the car who was getting grumpy about like the backups and the traffic jams, later on walking to the transit stop at the same area, discovers this, by happenstance, this little lovely poem that is set in place. For the students, I'm giving one of these books to your library at the school. Every contributor writer got a couple of these books. And so, you know, quite knit the city bones, ride the veins. And then later on you see that poem. And this is my favorite one here. Some have evolved to commute upright smiling. So it's just great to just have all this idea coming in. So I basically was a curator on this thing, but came up with this idea that there would be like this thing that happened over the course of the construction process, letting that be part of it, and giving the writers time to think about what is going to be said. Community process. This is a group of people that for growing Vine Street in downtown Seattle in a neighborhood called Belltown, Denny Regrade area. It started about 25 years ago. To complement this community garden. And what we did is started to do an urban harvesting of water that respects the fact that this is the watershed that comes into Seattle, and there's a finite amount of water. We have to share it with the fish, and how are we going to harvest the roof watershed, the gray water, the black water, and start making the cities far more responsible. I'm running a little short on time here, so I'm just going to bang through this series of images. This is a cistern, beckoning cistern. So there's a number of cisterns that collect the water and celebrate it. Typically, they're buried down in the ground, and you never get access to that water. So, and then these are ways of catching the water, coming down the side of the building. This is the same version, but this is your Home Depot version that you can rip off for me. And then this is the bucket brigade. Here's the water glass, the water table, expressing the head of water coming off from a 10-story condominium. This was a project where the private developer and I worked very nicely together, and we had a great outcome. And this is the cistern steps, and this is the outfall. Eventually, we're going to get down to bringing the water down and letting it go into Puget Sound, but clean and being scrubbed as it makes its way down. And this is just the way that a country boy is saying we've got to bring these kind of ethos into the city to kind of do some work. This is actually a Whole Foods in Pasadena, which takes the chiller water, which is an incredible amount of water that gets dumped into the storm drain, costs them a fair amount of money, and it can be redirected through this cleansing process and used for irrigation or flushing toilets. Doha, California, in Qatar, I'm just worried about time because, I guess I'm okay. Okay, good. I know there's going to be a movie. There's the people, there's a movie. Maybe they'll come in and they'll think this is the movie. I don't know. So this is a project where I was invited by some streetscape planners that were really in an office that was run by street engineers for a street in Doha, in Qatar. And my notion is to all the ablution water from the mosques were being dumped into the storm drain. Water is very expensive, and so I wanted to redirect the water to a garden, and at each one of these mosques as a way for them to take home this notion that, oh, this could happen, and maybe I could do that with my shower water at home. But it's me, a guy coming from Seattle, Washington, and what do I know? And this is kind of a detail of what hopefully could happen is that this ablution water would run through a poetic saying and enrich this garden based on the Quran, perhaps, or whatever. So I went to Sana Yemen to look at something that's been going on for 500 years, where some patrons had bought up areas and deeded it as public food gardens next to mosques. And so this has been going on for 500 years, and this is the proof that I was able to take back to the clients in Doha. And this is the beautiful historic district of, it's a World Heritage Site. I mean, look at those buildings, they're quite gorgeous. And these green patches are the various gardens that are sistered next to the mosque. This, unfortunately, what's going on in new construction over there, just no clue of using what you've got to work with. You saw the woodman gathering the wood along the urban alleyway, and at the Frye Dolos, which is the concrete structure there, hugging a root wad, which is a bioremediation device. There's a lot of this happening because of the seas slowly rising, and so these dolos become anchors, and it becomes this ballet between, almost like the woodman trying to pick up this weight on its back and its task. These 1-ton dolos strapped onto the root wads, holding in place as the sea slowly rises as anchors. But being obvious about it, the Army Corps is doing this now, but they hide all this stuff. They're not acknowledging the fact that we are intervening. The dolos are based on shoreline armor that you see throughout the world. So it is a common signal about what these are doing. I was commissioned to do a piece for the Army Corps of Engineers on the Duwamish, and I noticed in their early drawings there were some root wads they had out there, and I says, they need anchors. So I came up with this kind of parade ground in front of the Duwamish River, where this would be a battalion of the dolos under the command of the colonel of the Army Corps of Engineers. This was where the colonel would look out over his parade ground, where the dolos would be in formation, waiting to be deployed to deposit their root wads into the water. This was because the Army Corps, who's the permitter, didn't have a permit for their own property to put the root wads in the river yet. So this was a way to give them a strategy to. This was a holding pattern from them until they got their act together, and this could happen. And then the same idea's been brought somewhat down to the waterfront of Seattle, where we're in the midst of tearing down this viaduct. That line that you see all along there, it's coming down. It's seismically compromised, and the whole waterfront is being redesigned so that salmon can migrate along the shoreline edge. But, it's not going to be but 100 years before the sea rise, as present predictions have it, that that's all going to be compromised. So this is the site that I'm working on. It was a landing for the Salish early on. This is that site today. Notice they've got the high water mark right here. That's a little bit optimistic and naive. It's like embedded right into, it's a mark that's going to be fixed there. So someday it's going to be an artifact. That's their high water mark. There's the viaduct with its exoskeleton that's bracing up the compromised concrete structure. This is the flood at 6 foot what's going to be inundated along the waterfront. And basically what's strange here is the red arrow shows the expansion of urban growth and taking of the shoreline, and the green is the direction that, that climate change is reclaiming it all. Here is my proposal along the waterfront, consisting of dolos in the foreground, which are at the ready, waiting for the permits to happen for the beach that they're going to make. It's going to be an artificial beach. So again, here's this perversity that's going on. And beyond that are 3 banks 30 feet long of concrete, well, the sandbags. They suggest sandbags, but they're really full of concrete. They're the equivalent of a Jersey barrier, only these are the sea barrier that will be picked up and moved around if need be. As with the dolos, they will eventually be, here's a close-up of it. So we've got kids playing on them now. Maybe they'll wonder what they're for. And then at some point they'll be redeployed down on into holding on to logs into this artificial beach. So this is where the existing viaduct structure is with their very large footings. And this is 2 of the columns that I was proposing to save, but that has not happened, unfortunately, because I think some adjacent property owners have problems with them. But they would have been strong icons of like the follies of our past. And there's no reference left at all to that viaduct when they're finished with it. Another concern is, or opportunity perhaps, is that these, the red markings you see all along the east side of the viaduct represent humongous footings down underneath that could provide 100 years from now the footings for the new seawall that'll have to be brought in. So I cautioned the engineers to think about that before they just remove everything. Sea change in the on Captiva Island. Robert Rauschenberg's studio was located here, and for 2 years a number of artists came together for a charrette, and I will be leaving a booklet talking about this as well. It's also on my website, so I'm going to just move through this. But this is the Rauschenberg studio here. And just recently, some architects now have come down, and planners and scientists, to take it from the confab that we organized to the next step of this notion of what is the strategy for when you're at sea level for this island, different phases of graceful migration. How are we as humanity going to take on this, which will be a heart-wrenching task when you consider everything that will be inundated, all of our, much of our cultural institutions, a lot of our landfills that are at sea level, and all the Superfund sites. So it's quite depressing in that way. On the other hand, we've got biomimicry going on. We've got mangroves that can travel, can literally walk as the sea rises and keep moving inland. So there's messages there. Finally, you know, there's, you know, I was wondering why, you know, you see this, the poster for my lecture, which was kind of a surprise to me, but then I figured out, oh, I know why that's there. It's because of the mangroves. This is in Miami Beach, and these these benches are raised up off from the street. They're supposed to be curbs, and then from the rubble of Hurricane Andrews, this orchestration of urban rubble conglomerate suggested the mangrove roots stabilizing, and there's the logo, and then the movie Moonlight. And finally, as we go in for questions and answers into another room, I've got chalk to distribute out to y'all to go out into the streets and be poetic. The nice thing about this chalk is it biomitigates, it cuts down on acid rain coming from the hydrocarbons and whatnot. There's a poem that you'll get along with it. And just take it and apply it. This is a group of scientists that did work with the chalk along the March for Scientists a number of months ago, making notations about following the flow or whatever. Thank you.